turn to that at the end. The question I do want to address is that most evidence on these issues, basically almost everything I've said so far, the evidence for that primarily comes from cross-sectional sample surveys, opinion research, which is my way of saying that the evidence we have for the kind of relationships I've been talking about are good, is good, but it's not that good. It's only based on these cross-sectional sample surveys. I mean, that's a slight caricature of research is slightly more rich than that, but we've got to take the point. What I want to talk about today is field experiments, or the conduct of a field experiment, that allows us to test whether the experience of procedural fairness at the hands of police officers really is causally linked to people's trust judgments and their legitimacy judgments, and then we would think on to cooperation and advice, etc., etc. Because cross-sectional data, survey data, can uncover association, but can't uncover causation. I don't go into that. Experiments of the type I'm talking about now do allow assignment of causal effects. And I won't go too much into the conceptualizing experiments, because what they are. But one way of thinking about what an experiment is in this context is to look at the work of Shadi. All experiments, all social experiments, all experiments in general, have four elements that they share in common. Variation in treatment, i.e. you do something to one person or one group of people, like whoever the experimental subjects are, you don't do it to another person or another group of people. They have post-treatment measures of outcomes, you measure stuff in the experiment. You have at least one unit in which the observation is made, i.e. observing, in our case, people. And you have a mechanism for inferring what the outcome would have been had it not been for the treatment, which is just a fancy way of saying you have a treatment group, you have an experimental group, you get the thing that you think has the causal effect on the outcomes you're interested in, and you have a control group who don't get that. Comparing between the two, and that comparison between the two allows you to illustrate the causal effect. Some would insist that true experiments require randomization of the treatment. Actually, the experiment I'm going to expose to now does have randomization of treatment. Not all experiments do need randomization, actually. In the second experiment is in the paper, there's a non-randomized system. So, trying to claim, I think, that personal contact with police officers is probably one of the strongest influences on people's trust judgments on the legitimacy of the department of police. The best evidence we have for a causal association here so far comes from something called the Queensland Community Engagement Work, QSET. This does provide experimental evidence of the quality of interaction between police officers and individuals has a causal or direct effect on perceptions of police fairness, satisfaction of encounters, trust of police legitimacy. What they did in QSET, which was conducted in Queensland, as it was just in Australia in 2010, I think, they took random roadside breath tests, of which they do a huge amount in Australia, millions of these things each year. The baseline encounter in these road tests between an officer and a citizen is very, very quick. Basically, they just pull the car in, they march up to the window, they say, blow in this, you're negative, off you go. The encounters last less than 30 seconds on that basis. For the QSET trial, all they did is they took some of the core principles of procedural justice, dignity, respect, clear communication, transparency, etc., etc. They operationalised those into a checklist that the officers had to deliver in this encounter, increased the encounter length to 90 seconds, and as a result, people received that treatment, received that intervention, had higher levels of trust in police fairness, higher levels of satisfaction with the encounter, and they granted the police more legitimacy on that basis. The experiment I want to talk about was designed exactly as a replication of this. So one of the key strengths, I think, of the experimental method is you can replicate it across different contexts. And actually, it's in the process of replication that you really be able to get firmly towards the causal effects that you're interested in. And this was conducted in Scotland, and the Christmas just passed. And we tried to do it, myself and my colleague Sarah McQueen from the University of Edinburgh, we tried to do it in as close a way, or a way that matched what they'd done in Australia as closely as possible. So this was doing the National Festive Road Safety Campaign. The name does what it says on the tin. Really, it's all around drink driving safety over the Christmas period, and to try and encourage drivers to not drink, drive safely, etc., etc. They don't do random stops. They claim, I think they do random stops in effect, but there's a slightly different context. Drivers are stopped by the police with the aim of preventing drink driving and primarily, actually, aim improving vehicle and driver safety. So they'll pull someone over if they've got broken tail lights, they may or may not give them a ticket for the broken tail light, they'll have a chat with them, they'll say you need to get a broken tail light fixed. If they think that's a good reason, they'll give you a breath test. You get the idea. It's kind of instrumental intervention to strike fear into drivers, but it's also kind of a process-based intervention to try and develop links between the police and the community, try to demonstrate to the community that the police care about their safety, etc. There's around 20,000 stops in Scotland over this period, and we utilised a matched pairs pre-post design. So basically, road traffic policing in Scotland is organised into units. There are 20 of these units. We group them into pairs based on similarity. So, for example, Glasgow and Edinburgh are paired because they're the two largest cities. Are similar. All the other areas were paired on the basis of similarity. So we had 10 pairs. We then literally flipped a coin to decide which one of the pair got the intervention, which one of the pair didn't. Then we had a pre-survey. So all the officers who made stops in the pre-survey period handed out questionnaire to people. We then had a changeover period where we provided them some briefing materials. Then in the post period, they did exactly the same. They implemented the intervention in test areas and they handed out a questionnaire. So we had pre and post measures of opinions, we had the intervention in test areas, we had the control areas. Again, comparison of what changes between pre and post in test and control areas will give us an idea of whether the intervention we designed really did increase trust and legitimacy. We experienced some difficulty in the design of this. Business as usual in Scotland was different to business as usual in Australia. Remember, in Australia the encounters were very short, 30 seconds. In Scotland they were much longer, much more discursive. Basically the officers were already implementing a lot of procedural justice in the encounters. They were good at explaining to people what they were doing. They were good at managing those encounters and demonstrating respect and dignity. So we had a problem here of implementing an intervention that was significantly different to business as usual. But we tried. So what we did is again designed a checklist. We had a number of key elements the officers were asked to try and get across in the process of every encounter. We said, please do all of these things. At the moment you're probably doing some of them. Can you do all of them at the moment? And we also included a leaflet that tried to explain to people why this testing campaign was running, what the police were going to get out there, what the public should get out there in terms of increased road safety, etc., etc. The key messages were around respect, quality, trustworthy motives. I explained why they can stop, dignity, neutrality, all the core aspects of procedural justice theory. And that's just a picture of you. I'm sure you can't see that. That's just a picture of the leaflet that we designed with Police Scotland to hand out. So everyone in the test group got one of these leaflets. Everyone did not. 4 basic hypotheses we wanted to test. We wanted to see whether the intervention, or this procedural justice intervention that we tried to design, increased perceptions of procedural justice during the stop itself, whether it increased satisfaction with the stop, were you satisfied with the way the officer treated you on this occasion, whether it increased trust and confidence in the police, and whether it increased police legitimacy. So 4 hypotheses. Just a quick slide on the kind of beauty of randomisation. This is the vaguely evangelical bit. I'm not particularly evangelical about experiments. In some respects, I think it's problematic, but they are very useful if you're into social research. So we've got a very low response rate in this postal survey, as we usually get with postal surveys. We've got less than 8% of the surveys had. There's still a sample size of about 800 or something, which is plenty. But because of the randomisation, that doesn't matter. Because the treatment was randomised on the actual response rate is integral. It's a non-representative sample. We can't claim this sample is even representative of the people who are out on Scotland roads over this period. That's not important. It doesn't have to be a representative sample, again, because of randomisation. So this is why one of the reasons why experiments are good, as well as being able to assign causal effects. But what we found is overall, across the treatment and control groups, driver perception of police encounter was very, very positive. So this basically confirmed what we thought originally. Police in Scotland were already very good at doing this. So this meant, for one thing, and this is what we kind of suspected right from the beginning, our intervention was rather weak, because it wasn't very different from what they're doing at the moment. Compared to the Trust of Australia, the intervention was strong, it was quite different. But what we found was, perceptions of procedural justice increased in the control group, that didn't get the intervention, and they fell in the experimental group, which did get the intervention. So it's not that we didn't have any effect at all, we made things worse by the intervention. This is where research going wrong. No effect on trust. Satisfaction with the encounter. Did you like the way the police officer treated you overall? Went up in the control group and went down in the experimental group. Again, we made things worse rather than better. And the legitimacy was about. So if we go back to our hypotheses, that's just legitimacy. Go back to our hypotheses. The intervention damaged perceptions of trust during the intervention decreased satisfaction with the stop. Had no effect on trust and confidence overall in the police, had no effect on the legitimacy of the police in some overall sense. So why didn't it work? Well, we're still engaged in some research around why it didn't work and why we make things work. But I think we can make some educated guesses. One thing we think we did was bureaucratise the encounter. So we made the officers so concerned with filling in, well, not filling in, but meeting all the criteria that had been given in the tick list, they forgot to manage the encounter as human beings. We slightly turned them into robots, if you like. I shouldn't say these effects are small, they are statistically significant. We also suspect that we made the process longer. Again, they were so concerned with doing all the things we asked them to do, stops became longer, they became more intrusive on that basis. They may even have been experienced as procedurally unfair by people concerned because they were longer. So if you drag things out, you're kind of suggesting to people you don't really respect them all the time. And you're not worried that they might have somewhere to go on to get this over as quickly as possible. It's also possible the effects of the leaflets were negative. It may be something in the design of the leaflet. It may be something about reminding people that they're somehow being accused of being bad drivers, and being stopped that night. Let's say we're doing some follow-up, so what happened. But I would say having effect on a tool is great. So this is actually, I was sceptical right through this process that we'd find any results from this experiment. So I really didn't think we'd be able to have an effect. We did have effect, just because it wasn't in the direction we kind of wanted, doesn't negate the importance of the effect. And actually working out what happened, find a lot of information for, in this case, the Scottish police and the Scottish government on what they might be able to do in the future. Just last few things to clear up on that. So things can go right or wrong as well as right when you do this kind of research. You really are kind of, if you like, putting your theories, putting your ideas right on the line. You can be proved wrong in kind of absolute sense. How do you deal with these perverse outcomes, theoretically, in policy terms? So I'll come back to this point in a minute, but one policy implication of this, if you interpret it in the wrong way, would be that police don't really need to care about civil justice. They're already doing all this stuff fine, they've got no issues with this whatsoever. Well, I can tell you in the context of police in the United Kingdom that isn't true. You do have quite significant concerns and problems around implementation and procedure effectiveness. You could use results for this experiment to say we don't need to worry about this stuff. How do you deal with that? It's almost a presentation issue, it might go a bit into that. Experiments don't really work in isolation. So we might have concluded on the basis of the QSET trial that this is fantastic, all we need to do is increase the length of encounters, get these officers to what they're doing, and trust and legitimacy will increase. Well, our experiment suggests actually no. You need to be very careful about the kind of implementation, the kind of interventions you design, and how you implement them. Beyond that, I would say replication against risk, but replication is really important for us. It's never good enough to do this kind of research once or twice. You have to do it lots of times to build a body of knowledge. Of course, leading on from that kind of these kind of problems, is experiments are not panacea. So I'm kind of positive about this idea. I think it's a really good way of doing research. It's not going to provide you with all the answers to all of the questions. They can create as many problems as many questions. As they say, complex interventions of the type that you're often interested in criminal justice are very difficult to implement in the experimental context. So even within the Scott set trial, it seemed very simple, and I invented it as it seemed very simple. I think actually it was quite a complex intervention, in as much as we had the checklist given to people and we had the leaflet. So there's actually two interventions wrapped up in one. If we'd have had a positive effect, a negative effect, we don't know whether it was the checklist we given to the officers or the leaflet that had that effect. We don't know what would happen if we take one away. We'll be able to go with the effect we observed, or we've got another effect. Replication in the future can help solve these types of problems. And that's two interventions. When you think about a justice intervention or an intervention in the court, they're going to have to have very many different aspects. It will be very difficult to design experiments that can address those types of issues. There's always a problem, and this is best summarised by Nancy Cartwright and I can't remember her surname, Hardy there. The problem with experiments, and all social research, is that it worked there, but will it work here? We found it worked in Queensland, we found it didn't work work there, but did it work here, is also a problem with implementation. It's experimental, it's RCT, results suggest that its implementation is good. How do we get from the context of the experiment itself to the wider embedding of that policy change? And a final thought, I think and this is tapping into some of the bigger issues around this approach, certainly within British criminology and American criminology at the moment. I think there's an increasing preponderance on the experimental method in some sections of criminology. And broadly that's welcomed. It is a methodological advance over the methods and approaches we've been using before. And it's great because you can decide what affects the causes of what you do. It comes with a number of attendant risks, which I spend a lot of time talking about in the paper. But just to summarise the one which I think is probably the most important for me, and I think this approach risks instrumentalising criminal justice research. Basically, you can claim procedural justice, you should claim procedurally fair, procedural justice is a good in itself. It doesn't matter if it purchases trust. It doesn't matter if it generates legitimacy. That's just the way that police officers should treat people. And you don't need to rely on the idea that it somehow works to generate trust and legitimacy to say to police this is what you should be doing. The danger of experimental approaches are we can say, well, actually it doesn't have much effect. It's a too complicated a social environment for us to expect that any particular intervention around procedural justice will generate an effect in terms of trust and legitimacy. Well, you could then, on that basis, just say, well, we don't need to worry about procedural justice. Well, we can't worry about procedural justice because it seems it doesn't have an effect. That's the danger. And another way of rephrasing that question, and I'll finish here, high customer satisfaction, to comments around it, is again a good in and of itself. We don't need an experiment, we didn't need an experiment to survey drivers in Scotland and find out they were generally very happy with the police officers they encountered. That would be on the basis of a survey, we didn't just done that. So in that way, it's a way of saying that there are lots of research questions that we might be interested in that don't need the kind of approaches I've been talking about today. And the findings of those research projects can be just as important, if not more important, than the kind of things I've been talking about now. And I will finish. Yeah, I think yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So does it apply in non-Anglo-Saxon contexts or in global south? That might be an interesting thing to put forward.
A slight answer to that question.
Why do you think it wouldn't apply? That would be more interesting to me.
So my main concern would be empirical rather than conceptual. So there's been research in South Africa, in Ghana, in Pakistan, and a couple of other places. And what that research tends to find is that in contexts like that, where you've got deeply problematic interpretations, very familiar, the instrumental effectiveness of police becomes much more important to people. It's almost as if there's a kind of baseline effectiveness or baseline social response that police have to fulfill before a kind of genuine procedural justice effect kicks in. And in those contexts, the trust, legitimacy approach is much more important on can they just do the basic job. The slight proviso would be that even in these contexts, even in South Africa, even in Pakistan, there is a procedural justice approach. So part of the legitimacy is still based on fairness judgments. It's just the instrumental effectiveness that we're finding in the United States or Australia. So it's not, there's no particular reason. There's a social psychological model based on some very, very basic assumptions about the way that human beings behave in group settings. There's no particular reason for evolution varies in context. It's the baseline effectiveness. It's empirical effectiveness. It's in those contexts.
Thank you. Right. Shall we go back to Sarah? Yeah?
Say thanks again to the organizers of the workshop. I know a lot of people have done a lot of work to make this happen, so thank you to everyone. today I'm presenting a paper that comes out of a larger research project in the UK involving the lived experiences of immigration detainees. So I'm going to talk about, this paper focuses on the themes of waiting and uncertainty in immigration detention. And my argument in this paper is that the material and structural conditions of detention really shape how detainees do time. And it exacerbates the difficult aspects of waiting for decisions that have the potential to really fundamentally alter detainees' life courses. So my approach, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm quite different from the sort of approach Ben has just talked about. So I'm really interested in detainees' narratives and using these narratives as a way to kind of really understand how people experience the day-to-day aspects of being detained and how they understand their confinement. So in talking to people who are in detention, themes of waiting and the kind of unique temporal aspects of their confinement have important effective impacts on how they do time and how they cope with the sort of uncertainty of their confinement. So before I start, I just want to tell you a bit about the broader research project and where I'm sort of situated at Oxford. So I'm part of a research team that's led by Dr. Mary Bosworth, and I'm under her research grant that's funded by the European Research Council. So the project, subject data to and penal power, incarceration in a global age, really looks at issues of border control, the criminalization of mobility, and the ways in which criminal justice extends out to areas that were not normally maybe part of criminal justice, like immigration and sort of services of border control. So the kind of main goals of the project are to develop new methodological and intellectual tools to help understand the global and transnational reach of penal power, and also to revitalize the literature on the subjectivity and identity of criminology. So our little small research team are really interested in notions of gender, of race, of nationality, of language, and how these impact on people's understandings of sort of where they belong in the world. And also in sort of host nations, sort of the ways in which those who deem themselves native or of the nation sort of respond to people that are on the move globally. So some of the broader research questions we're addressing with each project is this relationship between penal power and national identity. And again, how this relationship is gendered, racialized, and really looking at the experiences and views of those who are subjected to penal power and what this tells us about the limit and nature of the state in a global age. Just so that the presentation makes maybe a bit of sense, I just want to tell you a little bit about what immigration detention is and what it looks like in the UK. So at present, we have 11 immigration removal centres, and there's combined capacity to detain just over 4,000 people. The map sort of shows where they are, and they're really clustered in the south of England and mostly around airports in order to facilitate removal. In 2013, there were just over 30,000 people that went into detention at some point in the year. And maybe perhaps of interest to this group, the top nationalities are Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Nigeria. So people who are detained in the UK are really often coming from Britain's former colonies. So we really do see this relationship between people's movement and British Empire and empire building in the past. So who are the people that are detained? In the UK, there's really a mix of different kinds of people. So there's asylum seekers, and this includes people that have failed claims or claims in process as part of the UK's fast track asylum process. We also have foreign national ex-prisoners, so these people have completed the prison portion of their sentence and are facing deportation. We also have visa overstayers. We have foreign nationals that have visa problems. So in my research this past year, I've met a lot of students whose colleges closed down. They have no visa, they end up in detention. So there's really a range of people. And then we also have undocumented migrants. These could be people coming on a lorry from France, and they're detained with no identity, or sorry, documents, I guess we should say. And why are these people being detained? immigration detention, and I guess out of the interest here is that it's not under sort of criminal law power, it's actually under administrative power. So there's a bunch of different reasons why people are detained. And this can be to determine identity, it can prevent people from absconding while their cases are being processed, and it can also be to sort of hold people in place in order to facilitate removal. So the paper that I'm presenting draws on ethnographic data that's collected, again, as I said, part of the broader project in the UK, and this involves both the in-detention and post-detention experiences of migrants. So I spent about the last year at 4 different detention facilities in the UK, and also I've been talking to people that I met in detention who have either been released into the UK or who have been removed or deported. And the methods I've used are participant observation, interviews, focus groups. I do a survey, but I won't talk about that here. So in speaking to people who are detained, I talked a lot about how they pass their time and how they cope with waiting. So sort of spending time in the detention center, you really realize that people are kind of waiting for things to happen, a variety of things to happen. So that's hence the sort of theme of this paper is on waiting. And one thing I think for this crowd, people interested in law, so the detainees aren't being punished in the traditional sense of sort of criminal law power. And importantly, decisions to detain aren't subject to any kind of automatic judicial review. So one of the interesting or perhaps troubling things about immigration detention is that detainees are confined, but they have fewer mechanisms of oversight and really lesser legal standards than would be available had they been sort of charged or something under criminal law. So I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of photos of the fieldwork sites. This is Capsfield House. It's actually located just 10 miles north of Oxford. So I spent I think about 51 days there. Yarlswood, this is the primary detention center for women. Holmbrook, this is built to what we call in the UK Category B prison architecture, so it's about a medium security prison. It's quite high security level. This is mostly for men. There's a small women's unit. And Dover, which is run by the prison service, and it is located with a lovely view of France on a clear day. It's on top of a hill. It's in an old fort that goes back into, I think, Napoleonic times. It's a really bizarre sort of space, but yeah. So one of the defining features of immigration is that it's indeterminate. There's no statutory constraint on the length of time that someone can be detained. Now, the UK opted out of the European Union Returns Directive, which limited the duration of detention to a total maximum of 18 months. So for those who are detained in the UK, their detention is really uncertain, it's unpredictable. It may last a few hours, it may not last a few days, it could be weeks, it could be months, but for some people it's years. So this lived experience of detention really becomes one about waiting. It's about waiting it's waiting to know both when and then how detention will end. So is it going to involve someone's release into the community, perhaps in the form of status, or is it going to result in expulsion? So being forced onto a plane or eventually agreeing to go back. So the denial of liberty and the conditions of disease, confinement, do present additional difficulties for them. So they have to contend with significant limits to their agency while they await decisions of a number of different actors, and this includes their immigration caseworkers, judges, detention custody officers, solicitors, and also sort of advocates that may be working in their favor. So this concept of waiting is interesting, I think, because it's an exercise of power. It's one that manipulates others' time. And it's also one way that people experience the effects of power. So although everyone waits, we all wait on a daily basis for a variety of things, for immigration detainees, the lived experience of waiting in custodial institutions that are sort of characterized by high levels of uncertainty, stress, and unpredictability is really challenging for these individuals. And for scholars of punishment like myself, this notion of doing time in immigration detention raises questions about effect, about agency, resistance, sort of how people cope with this kind of quasi-penal space. So waiting in detention is really contradictory, both emotionally and temporally. Emotionally, it's highly anxiety-provoking and stressful for most detainees yeah, because they're confined, it's also associated with monotony and boredom and the kind of day-to-day experience. And in terms of time, the experience of waiting tends to mark how people do time in detention. So every detainee's everyday lives tend to be organized around a variety of different bureaucratic and institutional timeframes, not of their choosing. So I just want to talk about 3 themes that emerged so far in this research in relation to the notion of waiting. So the first is this idea of doing time in a very uncertain and indeterminate context. Now, this experience of not knowing what's happening with one's life was really challenging for most of the detainees I spoke with, but not everyone experienced sort of this waiting to know in the same way. So a number of detainees made sense of their time in detention vis-a-vis the prison and the determinate nature of most criminal sentencing. So one young man I talked to, Erolioba, who's a Nigerian man in his early 20s, he talked about it in this quote, as you can see, compared to the prison. So he says detention is more torturing than the prison, because at least in prison you know how long you're going to be there. But in detention, he's got no idea. So every day he's hoping that the next day is going to bring some kind of end to his condition, or at least some kind of news of what's happening next. So, interestingly, detainees I talked with also felt that this sort of notion, this kind of enforced uncertainty was one way the British government achieved its objectives of getting rid of people. So people were in this constant state of unknowing and uncertainty that eventually they would get tired of waiting and they'd just be like, I just want to go home, I want this over with. And this uncertain nature of detention really affected how detainees did their time. So some tried to impose a kind of order on their day. So one man I talked to, he described his sense of time in each day dictated by the hours in which the home office or his caseworker, his solicitor, when he might expect news. So he'd be waiting sort of in the night, in the morning, so after 9 a.m. when business hours started, he'd wait to hear something. If that didn't happen, he'd wait for after lunch. Nothing happened after lunch, he'd know that, well, it's 5 o'clock, everyone's gone home, he'd have to wait again until the next morning. So this really shaped how he did his time, how the sense of time was experienced. And for him, it was a very kind of sticky notion, that it was slow and still and kind of being stuck. So others describe their experience of waiting as being constantly on edge. So Henry, a Malawian man, in his mid-30s, he talked about it this way as being, constantly waiting. So he'd sit in his cell and he might hear someone walking. You think maybe that officer's coming to get me. So it's constantly sort of, you're never really at peace because you think, well, what's going to happen next? Priya, pardon my pronunciation if that's wrong. She was really hoping actually that someone would come to her and say, you're free to go. And she really anticipated that this could happen to her, and she wanted to be one of those people who she saw that were being released and could experience that sense of elation and relief. But unfortunately, she was actually removed to India, so she's here somewhere. So the second theme I want to talk about is this notion of being stuck. So immigration detention is supposed to be sort of the person's last stop in their migration journey. In the UK, in 2001, renamed its detention centres or removal centres to kind of imply this mobility that people aren't going to be held for very long, that they're kind of, moving out of the UK, they're going to be gone. But for a lot of people I talked to, they really told me about being stuck, that detention is some kind of purgatory, a space of limbo where they're forced to wait against their will. So again, Erolioba, this young man said before, he really says that we're just stuck in the middle. Like he doesn't know, no one knows what's going to happen next. And for some people, it really can drive them crazy. A lot of people coped with detention through their faith. So this woman, Mary Jane from Zimbabwe, she said that her source of strength was on God, and she referred to detention as a form of mental torture that she had experienced, and that without her faith, she would go crazy. And detainees also talked about the ability of the British government how the government's ability to dictate their time really impacted their sense of what was happening to them, and especially for a young man in particular, they felt like their lives were being wasted by detention. They saw their sort of peer group, maybe getting married, having jobs, going to university, and they're stuck in detention. And for some of these young men who've gone to prison before, they basically spent some of them years in this kind of limbo situation, and they really viewed this as punitive and unfair. Now, detention is only one place that people wait. Immigration detention is sort of, I guess, the most extreme example of how people are regulated in terms of immigration control. A lot of people are in the community. But for some people I've talked to that, you might think that being in the community is preferable to detention. For some, it presents challenges that detention doesn't. At least in detention, you've got, somewhere to sleep, you've got food, 3 meals a day. And then you're in the community, many people face destitution. They're not allowed to work. They don't get benefits. They live off 35 pounds a week. Some people have no source of income at all. So one young man, Hussein from Pakistan, he told me that in detention they had everything. They got food, shelter, activities, yet no freedom. Yet in the community they had freedom, but nothing else. Now Mira, this quote here, she emailed to say what was happening with her, and she's just very frustrated because she's not allowed to work, she's not allowed to do anything. For her, this felt like a real indignity, and that the Home Office in this case is making her suffer in every possible way. So, importantly, the experience of waiting doesn't sort of end in detention. It often follows many people into the community where they might have to wait for months and even years. So this last theme I want to talk about is this notion of playing the waiting game. So if we think about waiting, we don't want to think about, equating it with passivity. So, there's a lot of really interesting ways that the detainees I talked to try to exert some kind of control over their situations. For some, they agreed to return to their country of origin as a way to kind of put the prolonged experience of waiting to an end. Others I spoke with continually chased up their immigration caseworkers, so every day sending faxes, making calls, in an attempt to kind of speed the process along. A few others took drastic measures. So one man I talked to, he was really in this limbo position. The government would act to send him back to Ethiopia, would act to release him from detention, and he became extremely frustrated. And I did see his mental health deteriorate over time, and he took to calling the police to report his kidnapping as a way to try to make something happen in his case. Henry, who I gave a quote from before, he'd spent 10 years in the UK, and he'd been denied asylum. He'd exhausted all his options. And his strategy actually was just to wait patiently, because he saw trying to make the Home Office make a decision would be provoking them. And he thought it would be strategically better just to wait and see what happens. And in his case, actually, he did get eventually released on something called temporary admission, so it kind of worked out for him in the end. Other people, and mostly these were ex-prisoners who were perhaps more experienced with waiting and also often had longer, stronger ties to the community, also refer to detention as a waiting game. Marco, who's a Portuguese citizen, he said he's going to wait. If it takes a year, he doesn't care. He's going to wait for as long as it takes in order that when he does come out, his life is going to be sorted. And I actually met Marco in another center 9 months later, so he had actually spent, since I met him, all about 10 to 11 months in detention, and he was eventually bailed, but his case is not resolved. Another young man, Michael from Rwanda, he had come from prison, and for him, he could wait because he was doing license, which means he was serving the community-based portion of the sentence while he was in prison. So for him, waiting was kind of okay because he became very frustrated trying to apply for bail and keep being denied. So he decided again strategically that, if they did let him out, they're going to release him on really strict conditions and force him to live somewhere he doesn't want to live. So for him, it was better just to wait, and he continues to wait in detention. So I think one of the interesting aspects of immigration detention is that the majority of detainees are compliant. They do sit sort of largely kind of by and wait patiently for the Home Office to make decisions in their case. And I think what's really interesting is the way in which waiting creates and recreates relations of domination and subordination. So we can see waiting as one way that it's about being subordinated to the will of others, and that's an exercise of power. So we can see the interactions of power here. It's not that detainees are powerless. Detention does impose significant constraints on their agency, their ability to change their circumstances. But in the few examples I've given, and hope to elaborate more on that in the paper, is that there are different ways that people who are detained try to negotiate this waiting, and really do so in often some kind of creative ways, as a way that sort of makes sense of who they are, where they are, and why they're being held. So one thing I hope to look at a bit more in this paper is the notion of waiting and conditions of uncertainty and predictability as being productive of certain kinds of detained subjects who acquiesce to the dictates of the British government while they wait, hoping for decisions in their favor. But I think we think practically about it, if you have any other choice but to wait. And I've given a number of people cards if you're interested in any of the research on borders or criminology. Please visit our website. We have a lot of publications, information about the different projects, and a great blog that shares information about what we do at Oxford and our teams.